I started noticing something that unsettled me more than any emergency I've ever handled inside a hospital. And it didn't happen all at once. It crept in slowly. Between shifts, between quiet rooms, between conversations that seemed ordinary, that left a strange weight in the air after they ended. At first, I thought it was coincidence. Then I told myself it was probably just exhaustion. Routine. Too many heavy stories piling up over time. But eventually, it became impossible to ignore. Because it wasn't about what was happening to my patients. It was about what had already happened long before they ever got there. Regret. But not the kind people imagine. It's not dramatic. It's not a last-minute confession. It's not a powerful final sentence before the end. Most of the time. It's never even said out loud. Shows up in quieter ways. In the tone of someone's voice. In pauses that last just a little too long. In the way someone avoids certain topics. Or keeps talking about small, insignificant things, as if trying to fill a space that went empty somewhere along the way. After so many years working as a nurse, I realized something that completely changed how I see these moments. Regret doesn't begin at the end of life. It starts much earlier. People just don't recognize it when it begins. Because at first, it doesn't look important. It disguises itself as practicality, as responsibility, as adaptation. It shows up when someone decides to postpone something that mattered, when they choose not to say what needed to be said, when they settle into a routine that no longer feels right, but is comfortable enough not to question. And the most dangerous part is that, in the moment, it all feels justified. There's always a reasonable explanation. There's always something more urgent. There's always time. Or at least, that's what people believe. My name is Aina. I've been a nurse for 12 years. And during that time, I've been present in moments most people spend their entire lives trying not to think about. Rooms where time feels different. Conversations that start normally, but never end the same way. Silences that say more than words ever could. I've witnessed many kinds of endings. Some peaceful, some difficult. But there's one kind that never stops affecting me. It's not the loudest. It's not the most urgent. It's the quietest. These are people who aren't fighting death. In that moment, they're facing something else. The realization that, at some point, they drifted away from their own lives. And what makes it harder to witness is that it didn't happen all at once. There wasn't one big decision. No obvious mistake. It was an accumulation. Small compromises. Small silences. Small, I'll deal with it later. Things that, on their own, seem harmless. But over time, they shape an entire life without the person even noticing. As the years passed, I stopped focusing only on charts, symptoms, diagnosis. Started paying attention to patterns. To what repeats itself. To what shows up in completely different stories. That leads to the same emotional ending. And that's when it really started to bother me. Because I realized it wasn't rare. It wasn't an exception. It was happening far too often to ignore. And the most unsettling part is that these stories never begin in the hospital. They begin much earlier. In phases of life, where everything still seems under control. Where there's still time. Where there's still choice. But where, without realizing it, people have already started giving up important parts of who they are. Over time, I started realizing that those stories that seemed so different really weren't. The names changed. The ages changed. The circumstances were never the same. But underneath all of it, something kept repeating. At first, it wasn't obvious, because every person came in with a different reason, a different diagnosis, a completely unique life story. But when you spend years listening, observing, Being present in moments where people no longer feel the need to hide what they truly feel. You start to see beyond the surface. And that's when this pattern began to take shape for me. Not all at once. That like each story was adding a small piece. Until one day, it all came together in a way that was hard to ignore. Most people don't reach the end of life regretting something they did. They carry the weight of things they postponed, avoided, or quietly ignored. And what's most unsettling is that it almost never feels like a mistake while it's happening. I've seen this in people who lived for their families, in people who gave everything to their careers, in people who were always seen as responsible, strong, dependable. From the outside, everything looked right. And for a long time, maybe it was. But there was always something in the background. Something pushed aside. A desire postponed. A conversation never revisited. A decision delayed so many times. It was never actually made. Those things don't disappear. They stay. Quiet. But present. And they build up in a way no one notices while life is still moving forward. Because everything still works. Bills get paid. Responsibilities are met. Life keeps going. And that creates a dangerous illusion that everything is fine. But over time, I started noticing that when many of these people were finally forced to slow down, whether illness, aging, or any unavoidable shift, they weren't just dealing with the present. They were being confronted by everything they had left behind. And it didn't come in an organized way. It wasn't calm reflection. It was heavier than that. Like all those small choices suddenly resurfaced at once, demanding answers that could no longer be given. And what's hardest to accept, especially from the outside, is that none of it looked wrong at the time. One wakes up thinking, today I'm going to build a future full of regret. It's the opposite. People believe they're doing the right thing, that they're being responsible, mature, practical, and many times they are. But there's a very thin line between adapting to life and slowly abandoning yourself, and that line is almost never visible when you cross it. I've seen this pattern in young people, in older ones, in lives that had nothing in common. And still, the emotional ending felt the same. It wasn't exactly sadness. It was quieter than that. Kind of late realization. As if, on some level, the person understood they once had the chance to live more fully, that adjusted so much to what was expected, necessary, or convenient, that when they finally stopped to look at their own life, they could no longer find certain parts of themselves. And that's what truly started to unsettle me. Because this pattern doesn't look dramatic in the beginning, doesn't call attention, it doesn't feel urgent, it doesn't raise alarms. It's built in silence. And because of that, it repeats itself far more easily than people realize. I remember one patient in particular, not because of his medical condition, but because of the way he filled silence. His name was Roberto. He was in his early 70s. And at first glance, there was nothing unusual about him. Polite, calm, the kind of person who would thank you even for adjusting his pillow. But there was something about him that stood out. He almost never asked for anything, even when he clearly needed help. I noticed it in the first few days. He would wait for someone to walk into the room, wait for someone to ask, wait until the situation became too uncomfortable to ignore. And even then, sometimes he would still say, "No, it's okay, I'll manage." But he wouldn't. And it wasn't just physical needs. It wasn't just pain, thirst, or discomfort. It was deeper than that. At first, his family visited often. Every day. His children, a daughter who came more frequently. Sometimes the grandchildren, they talked, brought things, shared updates about everyday life. But there was something off in the dynamic. They talked a lot, and he listened. Always. He rarely interrupted. Almost never expressed an opinion. When someone asked him something directly, his answers were short, as if somewhere along the way, he had learned not to take up too much space. There was one moment that stayed with me. It was late afternoon. The light in the room had softened. That quiet hour when hospitals slow down. His daughter was sitting beside him, talking about work, routine, small problems, and he just listened. At one point, she asked, "Dad, do you need anything?" And he answered almost automatically, "No, I'm fine." But he wasn't. I was there. I could see it. He was uncomfortable. His position wasn't helping. He had already tried to adjust himself a few times, but he didn't say anything. His daughter kept talking without noticing, and something about that moment stayed with me. Not because of what was happening, but because it felt familiar, like that scene had played out many times before, in different contexts, at different stages of life. Over the next few days, I started talking to him more. Slowly. Without asking too much at once. And little by little, he began to open up. Nothing too deep at first. Loose comments, simple memories, small stories, but there was always a pattern in the way he spoke. Whenever the conversation got close to an important life decision, he would soften it. Change his tone, summarize, skip details. As if those parts didn't deserve much space. Once, he mentioned he stopped working early. Not by choice, but because it was the best thing at the time. Another time, he talked about a trip he never took, laughed and said, "You leave these things for later." And later just keeps getting further away. But it didn't feel like a joke. And that's when I realized this story wasn't about the present moment. What was happening there had been building for a long time. Not in the hospital. Long before. In the way he positioned himself in life. In the way he adapted. In the way, little by little, he learned not to ask, not to insist, not to take up space. And now, in the moment he needed to be heard the most, that had already become automatic. As the days went by, small things started to change. Nothing sudden. Nothing that would immediately stand out. But when you're there every day, you notice. Roberto became more dependent. At first, just to adjust himself in bed, then for simple things, like reaching for water, calling someone, shifting position. And what stayed with me the most wasn't the dependence itself. It was how he responded to it. Always the same pattern. He waited, even when waiting no longer made sense. There was one morning when that became very clear. I walked into his room earlier than usual, and he was already awake. Quiet. In the same position. The glass of water was out of reach, obviously too far for him to grab. And still, he hadn't called anyone. I asked, "Mr. Roberto, didn't you ask for help?" And he answered, with a kind of calm that caught me off guard, "I didn't want to bother anyone." That wasn't just politeness. It wasn't just kindness. It was something deeper. It was as if, at some point in his life, he had learned that needing something was a problem. And that the best way to deal with it was to adapt to discomfort. In the following days, his family's presence started to change too. Fewer visits, shorter conversations, more distractions, phones in hand, quick glances, automatic questions. "Are you okay? Do you need anything?" And, as always, he answered, "No, I'm fine." Even when he wasn't. There was one day when his daughter left earlier than usual. She said she was tired. that she'd come back the next day. He just nodded. No questions. No to stay a little longer. After she left, the room went quiet, and I had to go in shortly after. He was looking out the window, not crying. Not saying anything, just looking. And that's when something shifted for me. Because for the first time, he spoke without me asking anything. He said, quietly, almost like he was thinking out loud, "You get used to it, right?" I didn't answer. And he continued, "You get used to not asking, not insisting, not getting in the way." There was a pause, a long one. Then he added, "After a while, you don't even know how to do it differently anymore." It didn't sound like a confession. It sounded like a realization. Simple, direct, no drama. And still heavy. Because it wasn't about that moment. It was about an entire life. That's when something finally became clear to me. Problem wasn't the illness. It wasn't his age. It wasn't his current condition. All of that was just revealing something that had already been there. The real conflict didn't start in that room. It started years earlier. Every time he chose not to speak up. Every time he put himself second. Every time he decided it was better not to bother anyone. And the hardest part to accept is that those choices probably made sense at the time. They helped maintain relationships, avoid conflict, preserve an image, but over time, they built a way of living where he was barely included in his own life. And now, when he finally needed to take up space, he no longer knew how. After that day, I could never see that situation as something isolated. Again, because it wasn't. Roberto wasn't rare, he was just clear. Over time, I started recognizing that same pattern in other people. The details changed. Different names, different lives, different circumstances. But underneath, it felt the same. People who spent their lives being easy to deal with. People who never wanted to be a burden. People who adjusted themselves before it was even necessary. And for a long time, that's seen as a good thing. Being understanding, being patient, avoiding conflict. But there's a point where that stops being a strength and starts becoming absence. I've seen this happen to people with stable families, to people who built solid lives, to people who, from the outside, did everything right. And still, when life slows down, something surfaces. Not as a dramatic regret, but as a quiet realization, one that's hard to ignore. That, at some point, their life was lived more for others than for themselves. And it doesn't come with anger. It doesn't come with frustration. It comes with a different kind of silence. Silence that carries understanding. And maybe that's what makes it heavier. Because there's no single mistake to point to. No moment where everything clearly went wrong. It was a process. Almost invisible. And because of that, almost impossible to fix once it's finally seen. After years of witnessing this, I came to understand something that still unsettles me. People don't lose their lives all at once. They give them away in pieces. In small decisions, in avoided words, in reduced versions of themselves that feel acceptable, until they're not anymore. And the hardest part is that it doesn't feel dangerous while it's happening. It feels like maturity, like responsibility, like the right way to live. Until the moment they finally stop and realize they spent so much time trying not to disturb the world, that they slowly disappeared it. I'm not saying this as a nurse, or as someone trying to teach anything. I'm saying this as someone who has witnessed many endings that all carried something in common, even when they looked completely different. And what stayed with me the most was never the moment of goodbye. It was what came before it, Dot. That quiet instant when a person realizes, even without saying it, that they could have lived more fully, not perfectly, but more present, more honest with what they felt, more aligned with who they really were. And that is not something you fix at the end. Because the end only reveals what was built over an entire lifetime.